This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Allie, Thaddeus G., V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, and Gold_81. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and as we venture closer to Halloween, Samhain, whatever you prefer to call this particular day, that certainly is the end of the Celtic year and the beginning of this the new year and the new cycle that we tend to associate the return of the light with Yule. But this is the time of year when we're kind of going into that period of darkness, and the days grow shorter and shorter, as they have been actually since July. We're going to talk a bit about the idea of the Storm Hag. Now, hags, of course, are crone figures, hence they are associated with death, with the barrenness of winter. Oftentimes, hags are personifications of winter, and we've done several podcasts here that have talked about that particular aspect of them. Now, for this particular podcast, which I'm going to try to be try to be a bit more efficient with, and try to keep it to maybe 35-40 minutes, just to not be too long, is we're gonna focus on storm hags as they appear, particularly in Irish folklore, Scottish folklore, and also the Lake Erie storm hag, which we see in the Great Lakes of the United States, between the United States and Canada. And I'm sticking to these particular figures because there are so many. I mean, there's many different varieties of feminine elemental water spirits that are very, very dangerous. For example, in Greek mythology, we have Scylla and Charybdis. They are the ones that we see both in the Argonautica and in the Odyssey, where the men on the ships have to pass through this area where there is kind of a rocky crag that as their ship passes it, it's portrayed as Scylla, who has 10 heads like a dog or something, and she reaches out and she picks men off the ship one by one and devours them. But if they go too far away from Scylla, then they end up with Charybdis, which is actually a vortex, a whirlpool that will just suck the ship down or suck the men down. And the two of them kind of work in tandem. And so these are representations of the terrors of the sea. When you are a seafaring people, when you are going out, the Mediterranean Sea, which is where a lot of that particular folklore is around, or that particular part of the world. And then, of course, the oceans provide a terror all their own. We are certainly look at storms in terms of things like hurricanes and typhoons, where we have deities like Guabancheks in Puerto Rico and in places like that, who are personifications of that hurricane force, shown as a very raging female kind of a figure. Not necessarily a hag, not necessarily described as a hag, but which is part of the reason I'm not including her in this. But definitely this idea of this personification of the terror of these kinds of storms. And it's worth remembering when we start talking about storm hags, is that they are personifications of nature that all of our human cleverness cannot overcome. Okay, we're clever human beings. We have an intellect. We have rationality. We have been taught since at least the time of the Greek philosophers that this is what makes us superior. We have science. Science tells us how we can manage nature, how we can re-engineer things, how we can change things to be a certain way. But the figure of the hag, in addition to everything else we've always talked about the hag representing, there's also this sense here with these hags that there is an element of nature that we will never overcome as humans. That we can, the best you can do is perhaps mitigate their effect or prepare, but there is absolutely no guarantee that you will be spared whatever wrath or whatever effects you have of coming into their space. Now, in the ISFM, the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth, we had classes recently with Joanna Madlock on Baba Yaga. And I have a podcast with Joanna on Baba Yaga from probably my first year doing this podcast. And Baba Yaga we talk about as a force of nature. She is the deity of the forest. Her house is on chicken legs, right? It walks around and it moves around because you can never quite locate her. And Joanna had made the point that no matter, even if you try to do all of the right things, there's no guarantee that you will survive what she is, what's on offer there. There's no reason, you're not necessarily going to, just because you follow all of the rules, it doesn't mean she's not necessarily going to devour you or that you're going to be afflicted by some kind of a bad thing. Baba Yaga was interesting, and I'm just, I promise you there's a point to this. One of the things that she said was interesting was that she didn't care for men. And when it came to women, she didn't care for women who were arrogant or who were lazy. She kind of, the way I think Johanna put it was like, well, she kind of like women who were kind of stupid, and she doesn't. And again, that didn't. What we mean by that is one who comes in with an attitude of innocence. Now, when I say innocence, I don't mean somebody who's just like vacant and empty-headed. We always see the stereotype of that. That's not what she values. These girls may have a cleverness all their own. There are certain versions of stories where the girl, through cleverness, is able to elude any negative effects of encountering Baba Yaga. But in a lot of the legends, it's the person who comes into the space with wonder, with innocence, with the respect for the space, but with sort of an innocence that suggests that there's no art there, there's no manipulation, there's no commodification of the space. I'm not going into this forest to cut it down, to take things from it. Maybe you are coming to take certain things. But there's the idea that when you give, there's only something that you must give back for whatever you take. It's not just a free-for-all that we can take. It's not something we're going to conquer or outsmart. And when somebody is very, very clever or very, very warlike in the sense of having this conquering element, they never do well against Baba Yaga or really against any kind of a hag. Because a hag has the wisdom of the earth. She has the wisdom of the elements when we talk about her in an archetypal sense. But the hag also brings to us the idea of the fear of death, of old age, of what brings us to that point when it's no longer when you believed in the idea. Well, actually, I don't know that how many of us really believe in this idea, but there certainly has been a narrative throughout history, shall we say, of the woman who is there to bear children, right? Now, again, we think about that idea very differently today, because just because you have a womb doesn't necessarily mean you have to use it. But there's an awful lot attached in terms with respect to our connection to nature that has to do with fertility, that has to do with sexuality. And the way in which we participate in nature, or in the way we connect to nature through different levels of our sexuality. When if we're talking about women, we talk about when women come into menarche, when they start having a period, when they're at an age where they can, therefore, the uterus is operational for bearing children. And the hag represents that point at which that time that has stopped. Now, again, just because we think of a hag as a wrinkly, scary-looking kind of old woman figure, but it's interesting because you could have people who are in menopause, I can give myself as an example. I mean, I'm certainly don't look like a 20-year-old, but I also don't think I look like, the stereotype of the old hag either. But there's a certain wisdom that comes with age. And that wisdom of the hag is often also associated with witchcraft because it is knowledge of nature. It's knowledge of how nature works, how nature can heal, how nature can help, which is why oftentimes you see these women as midwives or as the wise woman who could do better than whoever the local barber surgeon was who would bleed you. She was the one who had this knowledge of herbs and knowledge of the earth. So when we talk about this, we're talking about this aspect of the feminine that there's a relationship that we have to it. There's a way with which we engage with it. And when you have a very patriarchal society, a lot of the thought is about how do we conquer this? How do we take this over, make it submit, and use it for our own purposes? But you're not talking about energies that are submissive. And that is where the hag becomes very, very threatening in the way that she appears. So what I want to do, I'm going to explore that theme a little more deeply, but I'm going to tell you a few different stories. I'm going to start with talking about the Irish Storm Hag and just a little bit about the Scottish, which probably quite similar in the way that they operate. And then we're going to look at the Lake Erie Storm Hag and even tell a couple of stories that I found here on how she's affected people in real life, or at least things that are attributed to the hag, and the connection of these hags to certain other folkloric figures that we see in the realm of fairy. And then we're going to start examining what that means, what this connection is, particularly the idea of the hag as a bringer of storms. Now, we have talked about, again, other storm-bringing figures. We talked about the harpies. We've talked about like I said, Scylla and Charybdis. There's another one we did recently, and now I'm not quite remembering exactly what it was. But there's definitely this association of this connection to water, and the connection to water is very important, and we're going to talk about that as well. So let's start with talking about the Irish version, which is from emeraldisle.ie, which is a site that talks about the legends and stories, and also shows you the places of a lot of these stories in Ireland. So let me read to you what they have to say about the Storm Hag. Across northern parts of Ireland and Scotland, people sometimes whisper of a terrifying spirit that can sometimes be seen before a big storm hits, one they call the Storm Hag or the Cailleach. She is known as the Queen of Winter, and her destructive power is most often witnessed at the end of winter, when her power is fading. The people of Mullett in County Mayo still speak of an evening on January the 5th in 1839, when before their horrified eyes they saw the ocean waves seem to swell upwards until they assumed the magnitude of a great mountain. Now, if you've ever been to Ireland and you've been out either on the islands or anywhere on the coast, it surprises me that there's a surprising version of this. I feel like this could potentially be a regular occurrence out there. Okay, from its summit, the spirit of the wind, the sea hag suddenly arose, lifting a towering and warped figure to the very clouds which veiled its head. Two gigantic arms waved wildly on either side, and at their extremities were hands of blue and green fire, flashing like lightning, while the face of a frightful ogre was visible in the column, luminous through the evening gloom. They watched as it faded away, but they knew what it portended, and the people of the village were filled with fear. All strained their eyes in the direction of the untamed Atlantic Ocean, waiting, hoping, praying for the fishing boats to return to the harbor while daylight yet lingered. And some did, yet many more did not. As the gale lashed the coast and the winds grew stronger, the full fury of the storm was unleashed. No roof survived that dreadful night, whether it was thatch, wood, or tile, and even stone-built houses were leveled by the grinding fury of the wind and waves. But overall, all the sounds of the storm were the piteous cries of the lost fishermen heard, and the shattering of their small boats against the rocks, carrying dismay to the hearts of all who listened, powerless to help. Of those who were caught at sea on that night of the fearful storm, few escaped with their lives. For days after it abated, many dead bodies were recovered and recognized by widowed wives and orphaned children. So this is a place that they're calling Mullett, and this is actually, I'm just looking at where it is on the island here. Looks like this is more in the northern part of Ireland, and it is, of course, on the coast. And yeah, if you've ever been along the Antrim coast in Ireland, or even along the east coast, like by parts of Donegal, I remember being in Bundoran and taking a walk along the cliffs in the morning. Now, mind you, this was a clear July morning, and the fury of the waves and the way in which these sudden mists could just overcome, and suddenly these huge gales would just whip up out of nowhere along these paths along the seacoast. And it's very easy to see where a legend of a terrifying sea hag would come up out of this space, out of this environment. It's also easy to see where a belief in fairies or spirits of the water that may not be so friendly to humans may whip up there too, because it is quite uncanny the way that these phenomena come up. Again, I'm not necessarily. I don't know one way or the other whether they would be any kind of fairy phenomena, or if they're actually just a kind of what we think of as a natural occurrence, just based on the environment that's there. But it's very easy when you're along these coasts to see, and especially if you're out on any of the islands, to see how the fury of the Atlantic Ocean or of the North Sea can really be pretty problematic here. Now, the one in Scotland, the Cailleach, I'm just reading this little bit from Wikipedia, is a hag goddess concerned with creation, harvest, the weather, and sovereignty. In partnership with goddess Brige, she is a seasonal goddess, seen as ruling the winter months while Brige rules the summer. In Scotland, a group of hags known as the Cailleachan, the Storm Hags, are seen as personifications of the elemental powers of nature, especially in a destructive aspect. They are said to be particularly active in raising the windstorms of spring during the period known as a Cailleach. So there's that again, this idea of the hag showing up at the end of winter. When we think, we're moving into spring, you're moving into that very fragile new place where new life starts being born, where you start to see, you have the little snowdrops that'll flower, or you'll have you have all these things that will suddenly they start to appear. You'll start to see your little sprouts. You'll see the little buds appearing on the trees and in different places. And this is actually a very fragile time, and I think that is something worth thinking about here. Because the hag almost in this case represents that an aspect of, okay, if we think about the mother, the complex archetype of the mother, which is both gives birth, which is nurturing, which is protective of the child, but also is potentially destructive. I mean, in nature, you have both. We only tend to look at one aspect of that and not on the other. But if you think about pregnancy is actually an extraordinarily dangerous thing. So the idea that you have this storm hag who appears at a time when we're kind of seeing the new birth of nature. We've come through the barrenness of winter, and this is often conceived of as the hag not being willing to give up her claim to her time of the year. Which is why you see like things in Poland about Marzana, the goddess of winter, being kind of drowned or in the waters, because they want to stamp out the influence of the hag as the spring comes in. And I think that's just very interesting that this is the storms that come in at a time when the new growth is just beginning to sprout, and there's the potential here to be very destructive of that, for this storm to come in, regardless of what kind of a storm it is. But if we talk about a storm at sea, that threatens to take you back, threatens to take, to kind of take you back to that abyss that almost exists before birth, or in an in-between state, a liminal state between birth and death. So she can represent death also to this new life, which also can be a threat. I think this also connects this kind of hag mythology or this hag folklore to figures like Mormo or Gello or the Lamia, who are child stealers. We've talked about the hag as the child stealer, And that can be another aspect of it, this idea of this force that can come in, and when a new birth is going to take place, it's a death that occurs right at the moment of birth. So there does seem to be an element of that here. So let's talk about the Lake Erie Storm Hag. Now, this is from AmericanFolklore.net, and they do have a little video here about somebody's experience, and this is excerpted from Spooky, Pennsylvania. So I will read this to you. It says, she lurks below the surface of the lake near Presque Isle, her lithe form forever swimming through the weeds and the mire. Pale and green of skin, her yellow eyes shine luminously in the dark, and her thin, long arms wrap themselves around the unwary, while foul green pointed teeth sink into soft flesh, and sharp nails at the end of long bony fingers stroke you into the deepest sleep there is. She is called by many names, but to sailors of Lake Erie, she is known as the Storm Hag. The creature is a sea witch, an evil Jenny Greenteeth, and we've done a podcast on Jenny Greenteeth and Peg Powler before, who summoned the storms and pulled shipwrecked sailors down into her evil embrace to live with her forever at the bottom of the lake. Sometimes she waits until the calm right after the storm to attack. When the sailors relax their guard, lulled to thinking the danger has passed with the Storm Hag bursts forth from the dark waters of the lake, spewing forth lightning and wind like venom, and the ship will vanish, never to be seen again. Now let me just stop there for a minute before I go on. This is interesting because, again, after the calm after the storm is when she will suddenly appear. And again, similarly, when winter is ending and you think when you're at this point where you think the danger of something has passed, if we think about the storm hags that are connected with, we saw in Ireland and in Scotland, it's almost the idea that this is, there's this moment of danger but you have to, this passage that you have to make. And when you think that the danger has passed, similarly, like when we get into spring, we think winter is over, right? And that now we're in the clear, now we're going to move into this. There's something that comes in and brings this kind of destructive element. Okay, to continue here. There's only one warning before she strikes. If you listen closely, you can hear her singing against the harsh wind and thrashing waves. Come into the water, love, dance beneath the waves, where dwell the bones of sailor lads inside my saffron cave. And it's saffron because it's red, which again starts to remind us of Black Annis, of course, who specifically targets children. But the idea of this hag who's there to devour these sailors or to bring them in. It says, if you can, flee immediately, for the storm hag is right beside you. If you cannot, then pray to your God for mercy, for the storm hag will grant you none. Her whirlpool, okay, there's shades of Charybdis, right, will suck down your ship, and her long green arms will lovingly stroke you into the depths of the lake, where she will feast on your body among the weeds, okay? So yeah, we had this cannibalistic idea. You have this idea of Charybdis, like we saw in Greek mythology, of this whirlpool that will suck you down. It's this very unforgiving aspect of the water and of the storm. And it's something, again, with this one, there's an element of the unexpected. It's something that can appear out of nowhere. It's capricious. Like nature, it doesn't follow any rules. It just appears when it wants, and it takes what it wants. So let me talk a little bit about some of these real-life disappearances. This is from a hub page on religion and philosophy and Legends of the Storm Hag of Lake Erie. Some of this is taken from that previous website, but this is just a little piece that I was interested in on the real-life disappearances. It says, the Storm Hag has been blamed for centuries for the deaths and disappearances of numerous ships and sailors who have ventured out onto Lake Erie's waters and never returned. In 1782, a ship was caught in a storm on the lake. The storm raged for well over an hour as the desperate sailors clung to ship and life alike. When the storm finally settled, the sailors saw they were near Presque Isle. As they tried to make their way back to port, the Storm Hag rose from the depths and attacked the ship. People on the shore could hear the anguished sailors as they watched the ship sink beneath the waves. A host of other ships and sailors have gone missing on the lake over the years. Another notable example is the disappearance of the Clevco, an oil tanker, and the Admiral, a tugboat that was pulling the Clevco. During their voyage, a strange snowstorm appeared on the lake. the admiral disappeared with the tow line angled towards the bottom of the lake, indicating that the admiral had sank. A distress call was sent out from the Klevko. The next day, the Klevko was found 15 miles away from its original location. The Civil Air Patrol called it in and then watched the ship disappear into the strange snowstorm again. This was in 1942, and to this day, the ships and the crew members have not been found. So the boat is not even able to be recovered in the lake. Beneath the waves, says a local legend says you can hear the cries and screams of drowned sailors on Presque Isle just before or after a storm. Lake Erie has been known as an unpredictable and large body of water for millennia. Many stories and legends originate from its dark depths. Are these deaths and disappearances simply the cause of random storms and waves, or are they the result of a storm hag luring her victims to their watery graves to join her for all eternity in her saffron caves? So those are the stories that we have. Now, that's another interesting thing too, is we're not, similarly like I've said about this winter-spring thing, a lot of times these are snowstorms that appear. In certainly what we see in Ireland and Scotland is this could be the onset of a massive storm on the ocean. But it can also take the form of a snowstorm, which makes sense. Because again, if we think of storms that happen at the end of winter and the beginning of spring, these can be snow, that's often the snowstorm. We deal with that actually a lot here in where I live in New Jersey, where we will go through the winter, we may have some snow like late January, early February. Then it will seem like it's warming up and that we're moving towards spring. And then all of a sudden, like literally just around the spring equinox, boom, we get hit with 20 inches of snow. Now it's not quite this, because this is also about ships that are sucked down to the depths and that disappear entirely. So we're not talking about something. This is not something that's connected to the sea specifically, obviously. Like where I live, I live near a river, but I don't live near the sea. But there's this, so there's a number of things here that we can think about. Because to talk about water and water mythology is a huge topic. And again, it's not the first time this has come up, so I don't want to be repetitive on the subject. But let's step back for a moment and think about all the symbolism that we have here. Okay. Now, again, any deity that is a bringer of storms is one to, certainly like if I look at ancient Greece with Poseidon or Neptune in Rome, that these are deities that have a prominent place, because if you're a seafaring people, you want to show respect to the god of the sea. And certainly the ocean-dwelling deities like Oceanus and Tethys are definitely, now we're talking about the world ocean. We're talking about primordial waters, which are different from the seas. I mean, both have their dangers. Now, Lake Erie is interesting because it's part of the system of Great Lakes that's, you're talking about by Erie, Pennsylvania. So it's kind of this northern part of PA. And I live on the border of Pennsylvania. I'm not close to Lake Erie, but it's up there. And it's near Michigan. And on the other side of the border, you're in Canada, around Toronto and areas like that. Michigan's pretty central to it. I think Wisconsin borders some of the lakes, and probably New York on the other side as well. So you have this little alcove of lakes here. Now, one of the interesting things I thought about when I was considering that this is lore about a hag, and the hag they're talking about, the Lake Erie Storm Hag, is the one who's very, very similar to Jenny Greenteeth, which is actually a British fairy who is a water-dwelling spirit who will, this is usually assumed to be a warning for children. If you get too close, Jenny Greenteeth will grab a hold of you and drag you down to the depths. Don't fall in or you might drown. There seems to be a cautionary tale in these kinds of stories. But there's a great similarity in the way that this hag looks, with her blue and green with your yellow eyes, and kind of her slimy look that's very thin and emaciated, and of course this cannibalistic aspect to her, as well as the whole fear of drowning. Okay, and that she lives in this cave under the water, which of course is also reminiscent of the place of the underworld in many cultures. The underworld, if it's not on some western isle that's far off, it's literally underneath the water. And I do talk about this in my book, Death and the Maiden. In the beginning, we talk about different milieu for the underworld. But there is some similarity to this throughout the world when we think about it. And it did occur to me that a lot of people who live in Canada and who populated kind of that northern part of the North American continent, a lot of them did come over from Ireland and Scotland. So you do wonder if this is a legend that has been transposed from that area to this area when you observe a phenomenon that seems to be quite similar. Now, I can imagine if you're on a lake and after a storm things are calmed down and all of a sudden the snow squall just comes through out of nowhere, that would be pretty terrifying. But I think what's interesting about these cases is that the ship disappears and it's never found again. Some people have postulated, the idea that it may go into another dimension or something like that. And of course, if we've never found the ship, then we don't really know. We don't really know what that means. I mean, it could just be that the bottom is so difficult to navigate that it hasn't been found. But there definitely is something there. It's enough to make sailors afraid, or to make people even with these big tankers and things, which are more modern ships. We're not talking about the ancient boats, which clearly were made well enough. I mean, people could travel in these boats, quite some distance, but they're not built with the same kind of materials and technology that we think of them being made with in more modern times. Nonetheless, this still happens, which makes my point about nature, is that it doesn't matter what kind of technology you have. It doesn't matter how great you think your tech is. I mean, think about the Titanic. That she was the unsinkable, right? And guess what? So let's just think about the idea of water here. Now, I'm reminded again, my class on flood mythology that I teach at the university, there's an article that I have students look at from the New Yorker by Avi Steinberg called... I'm trying to remember. I can't remember the name of the article actually, but I know it was about Hurricane Sandy. Okay, which again does not have to do with Lake Erie, but that was a weird monster storm that came up in 2012. Probably something that helped actually decide that presidential election. Interestingly enough, because it was between Romney and Obama's response during this crisis, which hit the whole East Coast. I mean, there wasn't anybody. We didn't have power for weeks. We didn't have petrol or gasoline for weeks. And it was like we had this system of, you had to have an odd and even number on your license plate, like whatever the last number was the days that you could go get, line up to get petrol. It was really a very bizarre time. Traffic lights, power was out for ages. And you saw people, if there was any restaurant open that served coffee or food or anything, people were literally attacking each other to see, because they want to be the last one to get those provisions. And trucks couldn't really go because there was no place to fuel. So it was a major catastrophe when that hit. And Steinberg wrote this article in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. And one of the things he talks about the political nature of storms and things like that, and the responses of leaders and that kind of stuff. But he made a statement that I always thought was interesting. He said, "Fire tends to purifies, but the sea regresses." Okay, and so there's the idea that the sea in some way, when it spreads over the earth, if we think about the flood myths of Noah or Deucalion and Pyrrha or Utnapishtim, or the ones of Ziusudra, which are the ancient Babylonian Sumerian ones. When we think about these stories, the sea ends up covering the entire earth. And what it does, if you think about flood myths, the idea of the flood is that it's some angry deities who want to wipe out humanity for one reason or another. Either there's too many of us, as it was in the Babylonian and the Sumerian, or that's some kind of a punishment for humans not obeying the gods enough or being corrupt or whatever. So, but there's the idea that what it does is it wipes things clean and returns things to an original form. Okay? So we are So there's this idea of going back to the beginning, which gets back to the analogy that I've made earlier about the womb. The idea that we are moving into this womb space and the dangers of birth, the dangers of what's being born. I feel like the Storm Hag is very specifically this feminine element of the dangers of birth that is also attributed to something that is feminine. And the fact that she's a hag, I mean, again, we associate hags with old age, and also potentially with death or being near to death. And so this comes across as a pestilence, as something that is considered to be something that is a danger, not the wisdom of the crone who has a medicine that will help you, but rather the aspect of the crone that if you're not adequately prepared, or not able to negotiate it properly, they can destroy you. And that is the nature of these things. You know, there's certain things that you can only just hope that you have the least amount of effects from. When a storm like that comes in, and have a storm like that to make you entirely disappear. Now, psychologically, when we think about this idea of the deep waters, or being in the waters of the lake or the ocean, and this massive walls of water or snow or whatever it is that come up, or a whirlpool or a vortex, something that's shown as the figure of this terrifying feminine figure that's going to drag you down into the depths of the ocean, the depths of the water. The oceans are probably, I mean, we are learning more and more about the deep of the ocean, but there's still a lot we don't know about what's under the surface there. And so these bodies of water tend to be representatives of the unknown, as well as with their connection to the underworld. But along with this idea of them as being unknown, there's this kind of mysterious element of this liminal space, like I said, between life and death. And the crone in this case, I mean, it represents a force that can come in and can take life away, and you're really powerless against it. It is an aspect of the feminine against which it doesn't matter what you do not have power against it. Sometimes you might be fortunate. There is there's something about, there's a legend on the North Carolina, I think out on the, I'm trying to remember the name of the islands there. I don't know why the name's not coming to me. But when they have hurricanes and things there is a apparition that appears of a kind of a gray man who will be walking along the beach. And if you see this gray man, he is an omen of a hurricane coming in, or a storm. But it's said that the people who see this gray man are the ones whose houses survive. Like their neighbors' houses could be completely leveled, and theirs just stood there like nothing happened, right? So sometimes if you know how to look for it, there's a portent or an omen or a warning, which gets back to the way in which we intuit things, the way in which we understand what's happening with nature. I mean, yes, we have technological tools that can be very precise about certain things, but why nature levels some things and not others? I mean, with Sandy too. I remember talking to students at that time, and it was, some people down at the Jersey Shore, it was like, okay, some people's houses were completely untouched. Others, they had to rebuild from scratch. And it's like, well, why does that happen that way? Does it have something to do with the construction? Because really a lot of these places are constructed the same way. So what makes one survive and one not? And these are the kinds of things that make us think about these forces in a way that where we tend to personify them in some way. Personification is part of what helps us negotiate them in our mind, because when we're dealing with something over which we have no control, our analysis of it is part of the way that we try to control something. But the analysis is not sufficient to stop the thing from happening. So, yeah, I think this... It's interesting, too, because if I go back and think about Erich Neumann and his work on the Great Mother, okay, if we think about the idea of the feminine as a vessel or a container, as something which can be filled, right, as something which, if we're talking about it in the sense of a womb, and of course the womb is filled with water, the child is in that sack of amniotic fluid, before when the water breaks, that's when the baby is going to be born, right? So that's when the water rushes out, and the child is ready to go in the birth canal and to be to be laboriously removed. Of course, nowadays they have other ways of doing that, which, having not had a child, I think I'm just simply not going to comment on it, because there's all kinds of ways that you could look at the way childbirth is done these days. But there's also this sense of, so when we think of the water in this sense, there's the idea almost, of the water coming rushing in again. It's almost like you're regressing. You're going back to that stage where you were in the womb, in that little amniotic sac of fluid, which again, for some people, that's often used as a metaphor. Like Freud would talk about it when he referred to that with respect to certain things about this regression, the psychic regression back to mommy or back to daddy or something, where we didn't want to face up to the outside world and what was going on. But this is not really that kind of regression. And also, well, first of all, I don't agree with Freud on that. But anyway, that the idea of you in your development, when we talk about object relations theory, and I've said this many times, but you start out as an infant and you don't recognize the separation from the mother initially. Now, again, people have all kinds of circumstances at birth. Not everybody. Some people are separated from their mothers at birth and so forth. But there's the psychological impact, nonetheless, of the child not necessarily recognizing itself as a separate being. And from the point in time when the child can look in a mirror and identify that person in the mirror is me, that's when the child gains an ego, an I, a sense of identity that is separate from what is around it. And as that child grows up, the child develops an identity and a personality of its own. And by the time the child reaches its teen years, that is the point in time at which the child then starts to really assert its own individuality. This is when you have the typical teens, what my mom used to call growing pains. That you have this point in time where you go to your room and you put your headphones in and everybody bugger off. I don't want to talk to anybody. We go into those things because we are in our own head trying to figure things out. I do not like the way modern psychology handles this phase at all. They treat it like it's an aberration or a defiance or something that needs to be corrected by medication or something. And it's like, no, that's a normal stage of development. You are moving into this space where you are differentiating yourself from your family. You're trying to move outside the box. You don't want to stay in that box, right? You are going to eventually grow out and maybe start a family of your own, or you're going to somehow contribute to society in some other way, which you're sorting out at that stage. But the idea of a regression here, when we have identified ourselves as an individual and we've done the things that we're going to do, when we are in this space, the idea then of something coming in saying, right, we're going to revert you right back. There's going to be this new birth. You're going to be kind of taken into this new space. Now, again, you could look at that in two different ways. If you look at, say, a rite like baptism, where somebody is supposedly, in the waters of baptism, you're reborn, right? We talk about rebirths. You have people who are born again. And we really, metaphorically speaking, go through many times in our lives where we are born again, where the waters are deep. Deep water can be associated with depression. It can be associated with schizoid states in very extreme cases. The deep water is often that unconscious ocean, that dark ocean that we're drowning in, and where there are the monsters, right? And of course, that is always conceived of as being a feminine space. And so in this space, you are not moored. You don't have the rock to cling to of your personality. When you see people in a schizoid state who have word salad and things where they can't seem to connect. People who start drawing on the wall with feces and different things, they've lost their connection to the ego identity, and they have to find a way, whether it be through medication or through some other means. I think of Heinrich Fiers's book, where he had a woman who was in this state, and it was through drawing pictures that she actually, and him being able to accurately recognize what was happening archetypally in these pictures, and having her realize that somebody, it's like having the person on the shore who sees you and is sending out the rescue boat and able to bring you back, right, to shore. It's a question of being lost in that space, and we don't want that. We want to, while we can talk about control and over-control and being overly rigid with things, there's also, or we talk about it in Eastern religion, we're going to get rid of my ego. I remember my guru saying, somebody who said to her, please remove my ego. And she laughed. She's like, sure. Okay. You don't really want to remove the ego. You need, in order to be a conscious human functioning in this world, you need to be connected to your ego. Okay. And and again, I don't mean that in the sense, we don't have to talk about ego and egotistical as somebody who is arrogant or maybe narcissistic, that's not what ego means in this case. Ego is just the identity you have. It's the persona you have. It's who you are. It's who you think you are. Now, we can overprivilege that and not balance it properly with the unconscious content. That's where we get into this idea of bringing in the feminine element. But people can get lost in those deep waters. And that's what I think the Storm Hag can also represent. I mean, obviously, if you are a sailor, you are thinking about this in a very literal sense, about getting lost at sea and being lost in these kinds of spaces. But this can also be a thing in terms of, you can psychologically get lost in this space. That's the danger of working with the collective, of going into archetypal space. It's the space of psychosis. It's the space of, where you don't have the connection to, and you don't have the control over your ego, your personality, your thoughts. That's where the danger comes in. And I think with this idea of the waters, there's a regressive feeling to it, because when you think about an infant is born quite helpless and quite unaware of a lot of things. Like, we don't have memories typically of being an infant, and we only know, we have to be fed and diapered and dressed and everything. We don't have any kind of autonomy. And that's one of the things I think that we fear especially when we value our freedom and our sovereignty. It's like the hag in this case as the giver of sovereignty, in the sense of, and as the one who can take it away. You can be an individual who goes out and stakes your claim to where you are. But this idea of the Storm Hag is regressive. It is something that can pull you into a space. Now, even to go into a depression, you could say, would be going into this watery space. It's a space where we might feel, at worst, in a clinical depression, where you feel like you're in a void, in a hole, like you're just disconnected emotionally from everything. A lot of people think depression is just being sad. It's not really just about being sad. If you can feel anything all in a depression, that's good. That's what shows you can be pulled out of it. But when you're disconnected from everything, from your feelings, from certain thoughts, from your motivations, it's like you're out adrift in this ocean, and you have to worry about the Storm Hag coming in and pulling you all the way down. Right? So it represents this kind of danger that occurs. But I think it is interesting in particular that this icon of the Storm Hag, I think particularly we could point it to that the dangers of moving into a new space. When we think of something that has come to an end, and that now, a perfect metaphor, and now we're going to move into calmer waters. But then this storm erupts out of nowhere, like something out of a horror movie, where, oh yeah, it's all good, then all of a sudden there's the killer, right? I mean, it's right there. And, so yeah, this is the dangers of coming into a new life, is what I feel like these represent, at least on a psychological level. I mean, if we're going to look at the Storm Hag is representing what we deal with when we engage with the collective. And it's why you don't want to rush in necessarily without some kind of a helper or some kind of a guide or some way back. It's one of the dangers, I think, of psychedelic drugs for some people. And again, this is not me poo-pooing psychedelics or saying don't ever use them, because obviously they have found in certain doses that they can actually be helpful to certain people. And psychedelics, under the right circumstances, maybe can remove some filters and open some things up for you. But similarly, if anyone has ever had a bad trip, and I have no experience with this, I've just heard of this, that's another way you could potentially be pulled down, because you're doing something here that where you're kind of going where angels fear to tread. You're rushing into this unconscious water, and you're going in without any kind of a life raft. You're just kind of jumping in. So yeah, it's very interesting image of the feminine, but we have to look at it as this idea of the feminine as a capricious force of nature. It is something that that can come in, just like the forest, just like the metaphor of the forest. It can, no matter what we do, even if and this is why I think a lot of times people can cling very, very severely to certain forms of religion, especially monotheism, which is very bound up in rules. You follow these rules, you quote unquote don't commit sin, which is actually really hard, but then God will reward you. Someone will be there to save you. This is why I think people like salvation ideas, because they like to think, oh, no, I'm going to be saved. There's a way out of this. And that's something I think people don't get about paganism either. They worship certain older gods, and they think, oh, well, that god's my buddy now and is going to help me through this, this, and this. And it's like, yeah, well, what are you going to sacrifice for that, number one? And number two, not necessarily. That's not how these forces operate. And I'm not saying that to tell people, oh, they're evil and should be stayed away. It's not a matter of good or evil. They just are. And it's not, there's no personality or intention behind it. You can either, that's why I say being in a space that's innocent and open is the best space to be in. That space of where you have this attitude of surrender to the forces that are greater than you. And that's also a very feminine idea, the idea of yielding. And in these cases, yeah, these are not cases necessarily where you want to fight. Sometimes maybe, like the person who's treading water, trying to stay afloat until they can moor themselves to something. But a lot of times it's just you at the mercy of these elements. And either you just have to know how to recognize the signs, which is something many of us have lost the ability to do. And I'm talking psychologically now, not literally, in terms of hurricane forecasting and so forth. And then just knowing how to get out of the way. So I think that's almost the lesson of these kinds of things. The fact that nature is capricious. As much as you want to think that, you humans are we're the apex of creation, we're the best, we're above everybody, we're in control. And it's like, yeah, no, you're not. No, you're not. These are forces that remind you that you're actually part of a system that can be very chaotic and very uncertain. And that the way that you navigate that, I mean, again, there's no guarantees, but you navigate it by accepting it and by yielding to it. Again, if you get the warning, take heed of the warning, prepare yourself, but that you're never going to ever have complete control. So anyway, interesting thought for today. I'm not going to let this run on too long. Thank you so much for listening. Just a reminder, if you want to join my Patreon, patreon.com/Chthonia. I do extra podcasts every month on the weeks that I'm not doing these regular ones. And there's other perks right now with the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth, which is open. I'm allowing people to, if they have certain benefits, I think after 3 months, if you have the benefit of having free classes or free, I usually was doing them as mini courses originally, but now I'm letting people, if they want to sit in for one class or something, I'm letting them do that if they don't want to take the whole term, if they're on Patreon. And of course, there is the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth. Right now we're right in the midst of fall term, and we're probably about halfway through after this week. We're halfway through. We've had lectures by Dr. Joanna Madlock and Dr. Kate Kinsberry, both of which were phenomenal. Really, really good. I'm actually giving the next lecture, and then Dr. Max Orsini, who's also a phenomenal teacher. It's a really good experience, and the people who are fully enrolled in the program are really enjoying it. So So there's that. If you want to follow me on social media, if you're watching this on YouTube, please do consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell, like this video, leave a comment if you choose. But definitely anything that you do will help increase the visibility of the Chthonia channel, which is probably, I think I'm just about close to 5,000 followers right now. So it's still not huge after this time, but I'm trying to grow this very organically. So if you do like this channel, please subscribe on YouTube. And of course, if you listen to this on audio, this is on Spreaker, and apologies for the ads on Spreaker. I wish I could, like on YouTube, I can control having the ads just at the beginning and the end. Can't really do that in Spreaker. The only way to do that is to buy their console that costs like $2,000 a year, which I can't afford to do. So it's either that or have no ads, but that is, I don't know. I'm kind of between putting skill and Charybdis on that one, between a rock and a hard place. So in any case, so apologies for that kind of stuff. But if you do join Patreon, you do actually get to hear the podcast ad-free there as well. Social media, Chthonia Podcast, just one word on, I'm still on X. We'll see how much longer that goes on. And then on Instagram, I'm definitely there. I do a live stream most Mondays on Instagram, on Chthonia Podcast Instagram. And then it's at Chthonia Podcast on YouTube. 2 words on Facebook, Chthonia Podcast. So I think that covers everything. Thank you so much for listening again, and we'll see you at the next episode.